Now, this week, for the first time ever, the UK government used its powers to block a bill passed in the Scottish Parliament from becoming law. Scotland's gender recognition bill would make it easier for people north of the border to gain a gender recognition certificate, or a GRC, and change their legal sex. It removes the need for a medical diagnosis, as well as reducing the time limit people would need to have lived in their acquired sex, and lowers the age limit that someone can apply for a GRC to 16. The Westminster government says that this contravenes UK equality laws and that the new measures remove any requirement for third-party verification or evidence from the process of changing your legal sex, which they feel could lead to more fraudulent applications and have a detrimental impact on things like single-sex spaces. Nicola Sturgeon's government believe the current process is too difficult and invasive and causes distress to an already marginalised and vulnerable minority group, and that it is vital that the system is simplified. Well, today we ask, should it be easier to change your legal sex? Joining us for this debate are Ellie Gomersall, President of the National Union of Students in Scotland, Debbie Hayton, who's a journalist and physics teacher, Hera Hussain, who is the founder of CHEN, a non-profit organisation set up to support victims of gender-based violence, and the journalist and author Ella Whelan. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming in. Ellie, I'll start with you. The UK government believe the Scottish bill would make it easier for fraudulent applications and then, put people at risk in single-sex spaces. That's one of the things they said. Now, you're a transgender woman. Can you understand those concerns?
Well, I can understand those concerns from some of the groups who have heard a lot of the misinformation around this particular bill. I think it's really important when we're talking about, in this debate around legal sex, what does that actually mean? Now, if you think about all the different documents that have your gender or your sex on them, think your passport, your driving license, bank accounts, there's different processes for updating all of those, some easier than others. This particular bill is about getting a gender recognition certificate, which allows you to update your birth certificate. Think about how often you have to show your birth certificate in public. It's not very often at all. It doesn't impact things like single-sex spaces because you don't have to show your birth certificate when you go to the toilet or a changing room.
So why is it important then?
Well, it's really important in those really special life moments. So if you're getting married, the gender that's recorded on your marriage certificate is based on what's on your birth certificate. So if I get married, I want to make sure that I'm going to be recognised as a wife, as a bride. That day should be as special and joyous as it should be. And when I pass away, I need to know that I'm going to have dignity in death, and that my death certificate will also record me as I lived, as a woman.
Yeah, so Ella, it actually won't really affect anyone. You and I, it doesn't matter at all. It's a very small technicality, but it's a very important technicality for a marginalised and vulnerable group.
I think it'd be very wrong to see this as simply a case of fixing legislation or crossing sort of legalising crossing T's, because this is a much bigger discussion about whether or not we believe in the irrefutable truth of sex difference, whether or not we as a society think that there should be spaces in life, whether it's changing rooms as already mentioned, or more important serious places like prisons, like rape crisis centres, where whether or not you're a woman or a man makes a difference about your ability to go into those places. And I think also keeping on the theme of sort of being disingenuous, there is this sort of, there's a way of portraying the kind of argument about gender recognition certificates and self-ID and all that kind of stuff, as if this is just a case of, are you a nice person? Do you think that, how could you be so cruel as to not want people to feel content in their life and have the things that they want? The vast majority of people are very much go along with the line of live and let live in relation to this. Happily, we are in a country that's very liberal in terms of people's appearance, in terms of people who they love, who they have relationships, all that kind of thing. But this is, if you're asking for a change so fundamental as to change the idea that sex is something that is fixed, that for example, the way in which we socialise children, because this bill addresses, how young people will deal with this kind of thing, isn't along the kind of the binary of man and woman, mum and dad, whatever it is, then you're asking, it's a much bigger ask that has an effect on women, but it also, I think more importantly, has an effect on how we interact with each other in society. This isn't just a kind of, a nice way of tidying up things. It's a much bigger issue.
So just to establish, you do think this will affect people who are transgender?
What do you mean?
Sorry,
I think
who are not transgender.
I think, well, let's say, for example, that you run a rape crisis shelter, as a woman I know who does, and you are being asked to allow in somebody who has changed their legal sex or their gender or whatever, who is ostensibly in a male body going into a space where women who have had a particular experience. And it strikes me as completely reasonable that might be a problem, and that some women might want to say, no thanks.
Hera, that is, when this debate comes up, that's often the image that's in people's minds. The average person will be thinking, they'll be worrying about those ideas that a predator might be in a girl's changing room or in a rape crisis centre, or a man. How do you respond to that?
I completely understand and acknowledge where that fear comes from, because we see a real crisis of male violence, and that but the problem is that when we talk about male violence, equating that to trans right is not accurate, because if I, as someone that was assigned, female at birth, identify as a woman, I go into a rape crisis center, and I harass and abuse another woman there, I have still committed a crime, and I should be held accountable for it. So the problem is not in trans women being in single-sex spaces, because that is the place for them to be.
So the idea that the crimes will happen,
exactly,
whatever.
And also, I've spent 10 years, a decade, in setting up an organization that works with survivors of gender-based violence. These are people who, again, I understand where that fear comes from, but we don't create laws and regulations in this world based on fear. We create that based on principles.
And that is a fair point, isn't it, Debbie? So you're a transgender woman. A lot of people think of these situations where it's the fear of a single-sex changing room or a woman's prison or something like that. But that's such a small part of this. Actually, we're talking about marginalised and vulnerable people, and we're trying to make this process that's not intrusive and it's not difficult for them. We're trying to protect those people.
Well, we can simplify the process, but we needn't throw out the safeguards at the same time. In some ways, I actually agree with Ellie, and I'm pleased to say that a gender recognition certificate is in some ways a minor point of life. I don't have one, and I've no intention of getting one. I would say to people, I can live my life in the present without going back and changing a birth certificate, which was filled out 54 years ago. At that time, my mother gave birth to a baby boy, and that's a fact that actually happened. And I don't need to go back and change that to live my life.
So
now.
You don't think the Scottish Bill is the right thing?
No, I don't, and I think it's at risk of throwing out safeguards which are needed in this, and those safeguards actually support the trust and confidence that people have in that bill. What's been proposed in Scotland is to remove all the safeguards so that anybody can get a gender recognition certificate. Trans people, we don't hardly get a mention in that bill, Ellie. Trans is mentioned 4 times in a big bill. This is a process which is open to absolutely anybody to get a gender recognition certificate for whatever reason they like, without anybody else's say-so, with no safeguards, no protections at all. And I think that's unwise.
I think it's important here for us to look at what this bill actually does. So we've heard about things like rape crisis centres, single-sex spaces. This bill doesn't impact those because you don't need a gender recognition certificate to access those spaces. Now let's have a think about what the bill actually changes in the process. So at the moment, you're required to undergo a psychiatric assessment to get a diagnosis of what's called gender dysphoria. Now, the World Health Organization no longer recognizes that as a mental health condition. So we're being asked to undergo an assessment for a condition that isn't even recognized by the World Health Organization. It's really clear that the current process is really out of date.
Yeah, I mean, you say it doesn't affect places like a rape crisis centre, but it does make it easier. If someone may commit that crime anyway, as Hera was saying, but it makes it easier to do that. Someone can't abuse the system to do it, and this is a new way of being able to...
You don't need a birth certificate in order to enter a rape crisis. In fact...
No, you don't. But the problem is that I, as a male, have a male birth certificate. If HERA wants to arrange a mixed-sex service, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for arranging those. But if another service wants to be a single-sex service, and I have a GRC, they have no way of proving I'm male apart from my
That's
say-so.
not actually true. That's not actually true. Section 28 of the Equality Act, establishes it's legal jargon, but it establishes that if there's a proportionate means to a legitimate aim, then you can still discriminate under the Equality Act.
I think we should.
If that were the case.
I think we should. There was obviously the issue of crime, and it has to be said that there was an amendment put forward for this bill to prevent, for example, offenders from being able to change their gender in front of, for example, a sex offender in a male prison being able to enter a women's prison. That was rejected by the Scottish Parliament, which I think most people will think is pretty nuts. But moving away from the issue of crime and fear, I mean, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not afraid of trans women. I'm not afraid of men either. I don't think this is about fear. But if you look at the ways in which we operate in society as people with each other, for example, I remember the girls' toilets at school being a kind of a haven where you'd gossip and where you'd, learn a bit about each other. That, the changing rooms in the swimming pool, for example, you'd sneak a peek at an older woman and think about what kind of person you were going to become. All of those places aren't full of fear. They're about important zones in social life where we socialise with one another. And if you're saying that those things aren't important, which is never mind the kind of Section 28, the kind of legal jargon as you put it, I'm talking about what effect this kind of move from the state saying that neither is sex important, but as Debbie says, facts from the past can be changed, legal facts can be changed. That has a very big impact on what we say is true and what we say is false in society.
Actually, more than any other debate that I've done on this show, and I've done many years, we've had a massive response on social media and people getting in touch. So let's just read one of them we can get to. Rachel has emailed us to say, I don't think it should be possible to change your legal sex. Instead, we should be more accepting of people. And is this part of the problem, Hera, that there's a lack of acceptance and tolerance on both sides of this debate? So they've become entrenched. And actually, if we could just be a bit more caring and tolerant and accepting of people, that would probably diffuse this whole situation.
I think every citizen in this country needs to have the right to be recognized by its state in the way that they need to be recognized. It is a very intrinsic right. It comes before your relationship with your parents. Many people whose parents die in childbirth or who have no relation with their parent, their relationship with the state is still important. So what this bill is about is actually not about whether, single-sex spaces. What it's about is the ability to be recognized as the gender you want when you get married, to be recognized with the gender you want when you die. I think those are really important dignity issues. And yes, I think absolutely we need to have more compassion in this debate. But most of all, we need to have more compassion for young trans people who are hearing this debate and seeing their existence being questioned. I think that the whole world has moved on.
But the argument would be that there are two vulnerable groups here in particular. There's vulnerable trans people, but there are also vulnerable women who maybe wouldn't go to spaces, as Ella was saying. Whose rights come first? Who do we protect? Vulnerable women or vulnerable trans people?
We, like I said before, we legislate based on rights. We have to have a society that
legislates. But whose rights come first?
Everybody has the right to be treated equal without discrimination.
But by doing one, are we then
I don't believe so. I think that's a fallacy.
They come into conflict with each other. It's pretty obvious they come into conflict.
There was a time when white women were very threatened by the presence of men of color in spaces. And these kind of arguments came at that time as well.
That's such a cheap historical analogy.
No, it's not. Well, we don't want to get we can't get down the race.
Talking about rights, why don't we talk about freedoms? And I think, we should be saying to young people, you don't need the rubber stamping of the state in order to fulfill your sense of self, in order to become whoever
why not when you and I can?
You want to be. No, why not? But I think we should give them a bigger sense of what identity really means.
Ellie, literally 10 seconds. Has this debate become too polarised?
I think it absolutely has, because again, even in just this conversation, we're talking about things that this bill doesn't do. In fact, we're talking about the ability to be able to change the gender on your birth certificate. In 2002, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that was a human right for trans people.
I did say 20 seconds.
Yeah, no,
I'm afraid we are out of time, but I think it sort of sums it up really well. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. Holly, this is one that, I can safely say is going to run and run.
Yeah, it's such an interesting debate. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you to all our guests, and thank you to you at home too who've been getting in touch online to share your views. Really interesting.